The room was warm with early summer air, the windows open to a city thick with tension, and the men inside understood that once the words were released, there would be no quiet way back. No one in Philadelphia that July mistook what was about to happen for the ceremony. Ink, once dry, could not be recalled, and signatures could not be unmade. What lay before them was not a declaration of hope alone, but a decision that placed lives, families, and futures into direct peril. By the summer of 1776, the British colonies in North America had been in open conflict with Great Britain for more than a year. Fighting had already erupted in Massachusetts, spread to New York and Canada, and drawn thousands of ordinary men into an expanding war. The Second Continental Congress had convened in Philadelphia, a city of merchants, printers, and lawmakers, chosen for its size and relative distance from the front lines. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, delegates from 13 colonies gathered not as revolutionaries by profession, but as lawyers, farmers, physicians, merchants, and landowners, many of whom had never expected to challenge the authority of the British Crown so directly. At the center of this gathering were familiar names, though none yet carried the weight history would later assign them. John Adams of Massachusetts, sharp-tongued and tireless, pressed relentlessly for independence. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, younger and quieter, was tasked with drafting the document that would explain and justify the break. Benjamin Franklin, older than most, brought experience shaped by decades within the empire he now questioned. Others, John Hancock, Roger Sherman, Samuel Chase, Charles Carroll, represented colonies with different economies, cultures, and degrees of commitment to separation. Agreement was neither automatic nor easy. For more than a decade before 1776, tensions between Britain and its colonies had grown steadily. New taxes, tighter enforcement of trade laws, and the presence of British troops had sparked resistance. Yet even after violence began, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. Petitions were sent, appeals made, and loyalty to the king carefully affirmed. Independence was not the original goal. It emerged gradually, driven by frustration, fear, and the belief that existing bonds no longer offered protection or fairness. The desire that ultimately unified the delegates was not abstract rebellion, but security. They wanted the ability to govern their own affairs without interference they could not influence. They wanted laws shaped by local conditions and leaders accountable to the people they governed. Above all, they wanted certainty in a time when uncertainty had become constant. Remaining within the empire now seemed to promise only continued conflict, while separation, though dangerous, offered a path, unclear and untested but their own. The obstacle standing in the way was immense. Great Britain was the most powerful empire of the age, with a professional army, the world's dominant navy, and vast financial resources. Declaring independence meant rejecting not only political authority, but legal protection. It meant that the signers would no longer be considered subjects with rights, but traitors under British law. Treason carried the harshest penalties: execution, confiscation of property, and punishment that could extend to families. The delegates were fully aware of this. Many had already lost homes or businesses to the war. Others knew British forces were close enough to reach them if the conflict turned. Debate within Congress reflected this gravity. Some delegates feared that declaring independence would fracture colonial unity or alienate potential allies abroad. Others worried about public support, uncertain whether ordinary colonists were prepared to bear the consequences. The war was going poorly in many areas. The Continental Army lacked supplies, discipline, and consistent victories. A declaration would not strengthen their military position overnight. It would, however, eliminate any remaining possibility of negotiated settlement. The shift toward independence was shaped by events as much as argument. In January 1776, Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense circulated widely, framing independence in direct and accessible language. It challenged the logic of monarchy and argued that separation was not only necessary but inevitable. Though Paine was not a delegate, his words reached soldiers, artisans, and farmers, altering public sentiment. At the same time, British actions, blockades, bombardments, and the hearing of foreign mercenaries reinforced the sense that reconciliation had passed beyond reach. By early July, momentum had shifted decisively. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted in favor of independence. The decision itself passed without recorded dissent, though it followed weeks of negotiation and compromise. The task remaining was explanation. The colonies needed to justify their actions to their own people, to potential foreign allies, and to history. Jefferson's draft drew upon familiar political ideas, outlining grievances against the king and asserting principles of self-government. The language was revised collectively, sharpened and restrained by debate. When the Declaration of Independence was formally adopted on July 4, it did not immediately transform daily life. The document was printed, read aloud in towns and army camps, and sent abroad. Its power lay not in enforcement but in commitment. The most consequential act still remained: signing it. Contrary to later imagery, the signing did not occur in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded over weeks, as delegates added their names once the decision was irreversible. Each signature carried personal risk. John Hancock's bold script, later mythologized, was not an act of bravado but of exposure. As President of Congress, he was already a visible target. Others faced quieter dangers. Some lived in areas soon occupied by British troops. Some owned property that could be seized. Several had families who would be left vulnerable if they were captured or killed. The decision was not made by anonymous officials shielded by distance, but by men whose addresses and livelihoods were known. The consequences were real and immediate. British forces captured New York later that year, forcing Congress to flee Philadelphia. Several signers had their homes destroyed. Thomas Nelson, Jr. of Virginia reportedly urged American forces to fire upon his own estate when it was used by British troops. Francis Lewis saw his wife imprisoned. Richard Stockton was captured, mistreated, and released in poor health, his finances ruined. Not all suffered equally, but none were untouched by risk. The Declaration did not end debate or guarantee unity. Loyalists, colonists who remained faithful to Britain, viewed it as reckless and dangerous. Families divided along political lines. Communities fractured under pressure. The war continued for 7 more years, marked by hardship, shifting alliances, and uncertainty. Independence was declared long before it was secured. Yet the act of declaring changed the nature of the conflict. It clarified the stakes. The war was no longer about rights within the empire, but about existence outside it. This clarity made foreign alliances possible, particularly with France, which would later prove decisive. It also reshaped internal expectations. Victory would now require not reform, but endurance. The historical impact of the Declaration extends beyond its immediate political function. It articulated a claim about authority, that governments derive legitimacy from the consent of the governed, that would echo far beyond the colonies. But for the men who signed it, the document was not an abstraction. It was a calculated risk taken without assurance of success. Many were not young idealists, but established figures with much to lose. They acted not because the outcome was certain, but because delay appeared more dangerous than action. In the years that followed, some signers would serve in government, others would fade into private life, and a few would die before the war ended. Their unity would not last. Disagreements over the nation's future emerged quickly. Yet the moment they signed, their names bound them together in shared consequence. Whatever followed, they would be remembered not for caution, but for commitment. Declaring independence was not the boldest act because it was dramatic, but because it was final. It closed doors that had remained open through years of conflict. It transformed protest into purpose and resistance into responsibility. The risk lay not only in British retaliation, but in the uncertainty of what independence would demand in return. In that Philadelphia room, the men who signed the Declaration did not know whether they were founding a nation or sealing their own downfall. They knew only that the world they had lived in no longer held. The decision they made was risky not because it promised change, but because it offered no guarantee of survival. History remembers the outcome. What deserves equal remembrance is the moment before it was known.